So I thought it'd be useful for myself and Josh, just as a way of introduction for today's webinar, just give you some background as to myself and Josh. So I'm Leighton Jeffries. I work with CSI. I've been with CSI probably now coming up since 2014, responsible for all things security proposition within CSI, around all things go-to-market, services strategy, and vendor and partner management development. So head of cybersecurity within CSI.
And I'm Josh Davis. So I'm representing the Alert Logic, who are in partnership with CSI to help deliver those security services. And I'm currently in the role of product manager, really doing a lot of the stuff that's on the go-to-market side of things. But my history is quite diverse, and I used to be a security analyst, and I used to work in the Alert Logic SOC as well, delivering these SOC services. So I used to kind of find incidents and find threats and escalate them to partners like CSI. And before then moving into a solutions engineering role to try and help identify gaps in security and then find right solutions for that. So great, I think, sorry.
No, that's all right, Josh. I was just going to say, brilliant. As sort of introductions, that was sort of wanting to sort of set the scene as to a bit about who the guest speakers are today, but also the agenda. I'd like to sort of take us through as to what you are here to sort of see and listen to today. So the slides that we have an hour. It is open in regards to chat and conversations if you do have questions along the way, and we'll definitely try and answer them as best we can. But the agenda items that we want to sort of cover today are a bit about who are Alert Logic and what does Alert Logic do. For those that have joined today that might not know or have heard of who CSI are, we're going to do a quick intro as to who CSI is and what we do, and our CSI SOC capabilities that are underpinned with Alert Logic and the Alert Logic partnership. We're going to go through some of the challenges that we see from the SOC and the cyber landscape today and risks associated to those. And then we'll look to then take you through today's theme, look at the threat landscape, insights into emerging threats, Alert Logic, and also with regards to looking at the wider security community in regards to looking at what NCSC are publishing and things to look out for ahead. And then the second part of the presentation is looking at considerations as to what clients are facing today when selecting a threat detection response program, and how Alert Logic can help provide an overview of that through the Alert Logic solution. And then we're finally going to close off with any Q&A, and then hopefully answer any questions that you might have either via the chat. So Josh, should we kick things off and run through with initially a bit about Alert Logic?
Absolutely. So let's begin by just setting a little bit of a leveler for people who might not have heard of Alert Logic before and what it is that we do, which is Managed Detection and Response, or MDR. I know we live in a world where there's a lot of acronyms. Just in security alone, IT makes it even more complicated. Managed Detection and Response is really the evolution of SOC services to provide security as a service for other organizations, find 24/7 threat detection and response services. As well as understanding what vulnerabilities you might have in your environment, so we can limit that attack surface and limit the chance of those attacks ever really being successful. So what that looks like, we have two different product offerings that CSI will use for their customers. The first one is MDR Professional, and this is the one I like to start with because this is the bread and butter of what it is that what we do, and it's what really the main element of a managed detection response, and that is that we have a full team, 150 plus security analysts who work in 24/7, 365 across US and UK geographies to keep that service constant. And it's all about that service is all about limiting the impact of a successful cyber attack. And I hope that nobody's kind of ears are pricking up thinking, oh, success, like limiting the impact of successful cyber attack. I don't want that to happen. But the reality is that you have to be prepared for a cyber attack to be successful. And if you are prepared, then you have rapid ways to detect it, which we'll get into more detail as to how we do that. And then ultimately rapid methods to respond to it. So you can identify compromise and remove the actor from your environment before any real damage can occur. Ultimately leaves you in a better position when you started off as well, because you can plug those holes that allowed them the initial entry. So that's what Professional does, and that's our core level service. And what we also have then is MDR Essentials, and it's important to note that Essentials is included in Professional. So anything you put that Professional service on is also got the Essentials. But this is Essentials is all about reducing the likelihood of an attack. So understanding what your attack surface is by doing asset discovery, knowing what you have at any given time. It sounds very basic, but you can't protect what you don't know you have or you can't see. Then we'll assess each of those hosts or those assets for any vulnerabilities, for any risks that are associated with them, and then give you advice and prioritization on how to mitigate or patch those vulnerabilities. So the reason we break it up is that you might not need a professional on absolutely everything. Maybe a dev and test environment, that's probably going to be quite nicely gated, but you also want to have visibility into the risks that might be associated with it, so that when it comes to move it into production, you know that it's in a healthy position and you're not introducing any unnecessary risks when it goes into live production. And this is really delivered through a unified console that has coverage across cloud, on-premise, private cloud, all different types of technologies. We try and be as agnostic as possible, as well as lots of reporting to help with your kind of compliance needs and visibility in dashboards and other reports.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. With regards to CSI, as a global delivery partner, we are a managed services provider within the UK with over 35 plus years experience. We have offices both in the US and obviously the UK, primarily out of Birmingham is where our headquarters are for both our NOC and SOC. A bit about CSI, we have probably roughly around about 1,000 plus clients now on the books, and we have roughly now just over 250 employees, with probably the majority lent more to the engineering and delivery side within the business. So we're very engineering focused. We work with a number of partners. Today we're here to talk about with Alert Logic and the MDR service, but fundamentally CSI, we tend to work with best breed, leading technologies. So leading, not bleeding, where their maturity is recognized as top right magic quadrant in regards to Gartner. And fundamentally the services that are underpinned by the technologies, the tools, CSI have industry recognized services to address some of the cyber concerns and cyber challenges that we'll go through later on today. To give you some context about CSI's SOC, so the SOC itself is actually an accredited facility in scope as part of our recent external audits and renewed certs in Birmingham HQ. We have around the clock coverage. Partnerships obviously include with Alert Logic, providing 24/7 triage to critical and security incidents. I've mentioned that obviously we work with leading technology, so recognizing for being innovative and mature in that space and recognized as obviously a market leader within Gartner. All our tools are underpinned with ML and AI in regards to state-of-the-art security under the operations center. And obviously with the support with the services that we provide, we have monthly reporting and business analytics that we can apply to your environment that gives better efficiencies as well as automation around some of the security incidents to quickly identify and remediate where possible. The challenges, I guess, in regards to the landscape of what things look like today, I thought I would share this graphic. It's not my own. I have stolen it from a previous presentation. But what I'm trying to illustrate really is that for those that have maybe been at InfoSec years gone by and come into Olympia, when you walk into the main hall, this is pretty much what you see. It's a big wave of vendors, technology, loads of new shiny tools out there, all kind of saying that they're the next big, best thing. So it's obviously very difficult to understand where to start. It's a bit of a minefield for any client or ISO or CISO that might be on the call. So the question is where to start. In relation to things like malware and ransomware as a problem, there is a real lack of trust in traditional legacy-based technology. Businesses today have a real lack of skilled security in-house. Teams are necessarily getting smaller, not bigger. So the idea is that with obviously the rate of change and keeping up with that change, it's very difficult to understand where to start. So typically risks that are then carried along that are obviously potentially a breach or loss of data. Reputational damage comes with that, as well as personal liability for individuals that are in roles at senior exec level. And it's very challenging in regards to recovery around remediation and the costs that are ongoing to support that. So I think it's all fair to say for those on the call that we're aware of that with these risks, it's not if, it's when. And with obviously the landscape and the threats that are evolving in regards to the dark web, the forums, the communities that are growing within that, and the attack vectors that are susceptible now to bringing in new threats, either zero-day or advanced persistent threats. We need a plan. We need some way of understanding what the security threat landscape looks like, and this is where we'll now take you through the overview of today's presentation for the security threat landscape.
Thanks, Leighton. And that diagram you had with all the vendors is always really interesting to see how rich it is. I noticed there wasn't MDR up there, but in recent years, there's a lot of people who planted their flag in MDR as well. So that's also another difficulty to kind of address. But hopefully towards the end of this presentation, we'll show you some of the ways you can help identify the right partner for yourselves when it comes to those detection response services. And also, this section is going to look at the security landscape that we're seeing as Alert Logic. We have 4,000 plus customers who give us 30 to 40 petabytes of threat data every single month. And we have a team of global threat researchers who go through that, as well as making use of open source and industry private feeds. The Microsoft MAP program, for example, is a really great one that gives us a head start on Unpatched Tuesday when that comes around. So I think the point is that threat intelligence is always a real differentiator when it comes to any security. This is a game of cat and mouse that we are constantly playing with the adversaries. And I think it's fair to say that the defenders we're more Tom than we are Jerry. We have to be chasing after these threat actors and making sure that they can't run amok, and we'll constantly keep in pace with them. And that starts with understanding what the security threat landscape is, and then how we can detect and protect our customers. So Leighton touched on some of the challenges, and I just want to reiterate some of those in some way, and maybe add a few extra color. But dynamic environments, this is a huge challenge for every organization. It's very rare that anything stays static. People leave, people forget about systems they may have. If you're in the cloud and you're doing rapid adoption of new technologies, yes, you want to get the best outcomes for your modernization, optimization. But also you've got to make sure that security isn't left behind as you move rapidly through these environments. It can be as simple as somebody creating an old WordPress site and then forgetting about it for 3 years. When I was an analyst, that was actually exactly what happened. And you haven't updated a website with WordPress for 3 years, it's going to be riddled with vulnerabilities. So it's important that you know what you've got. Also, the talent shortage, Leighton touched on that. I think 2 years is the average retention period for security analyst. At Alert Logic, we have a lot higher retention than that, and that's because we're doing a lot more of the interesting work, looking at 4,000 customers, threat hunting across them as well. And we're able to add a lot of the efficiencies that automation give us via machine learning, AI, or SOAR, all those kind of things, to make sure that our analysts aren't doing the mundane work unless it's absolutely essential that they do it for the right outcome. So we can help augment those kind of teams. Tool complexity, Leighton showed us all those different types of tools that you could have. There are so many out there that can solve different problems, but ultimately they don't really talk to each other. And that can be a massive problem too. So you need a way to make sure you've got the right tools for your use cases, for your risks, and making sure that you have visibility across all of them to get the most out of them. And then really what I'm going to be focusing on for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is the evolving threats that we see constantly, that game of cat and mouse that we have to keep pace with in order to make sure that we as defenders are defending. We're not being caught with our trousers down. So the first thing I want to highlight is our emerging threats process overview. So emerging threat, this could be a 0 day. If you haven't heard of those are called 0 days because they've been announced for 0 days. They're that fresh and brand new. Whenever say 0 day appears, they're going to be able to circumvent prevention technologies most of the time because they're so new, people can't write rules for them and they have to kind of catch up. So there's that period where attackers jump on these because they know that everyone else is catching up while they can use them. But it could also be an old exploit being picked up, a new campaign starting to come out. Something like the Lapsus breach of Okta. That wasn't any novel type of attacks, but they managed to sit in Okta's network and potentially could have done a lot of damage from that. So that could be classified as an emerging threat. But what we do first, we need to identify what this emerging threat is. And so we look at CVEs. These are common vulnerabilities and exploits. This is normally your remote code executions that allow you immediate access into a system. Anything that's going to gain you entry into an environment, or maybe allow you to elevate privileges once you're in there. If it's critical, 10 out of 10, we're almost always going to be this can be on our radar. But we will make sure that we look at the different feeds we have, what content we have that's already out there, and what's the community doing, because that's really important. This is a community. Security is a community-led approach to defense. We all work together to make sure each other's detections are better. And also we can look at what the security analysts are seeing for the SOC incident. So have they seen something that might be brand new? It might, 100 days previously, we've seen the same thing in that kind of incident. All of a sudden we see a sort of derivative that happily to be caught of that could be another trigger for an emerging threat that we then put forward to our threat intelligence teams. I remember SOC and threat intelligence are distinctly different. It's acceptable to think they might be the same in sometimes. They perform joint functions, but they are very different. And that will be clear as we go through this. So when the threat intelligence team do engage with SOC, what they do is identify areas or telemetry signatures that are perfect for threat hunting. Now, threat hunting is that manual-led process of looking through your data. It can be incredibly tedious, but it's actually one of the more fun things to do as an analyst. It's what I used to always prefer to do and hope to get assigned to that. And because you're looking for needles in haystacks, but when you find that needle, it's super, super interesting and exciting. And basically, threat hunting is necessary to back up the automated detections you have. So even if you have machine learning that's looking for anomalous activities, even if you have all the best correlations in the world, there's still going to be this new stuff that you need that human backstop, that manual-led process to go and find those extra things. And this really is a cyclical relationship then. As the threat hunting feeds are passed to SOC, they find new information, they find instances of compromise. We'll reach out to our customers. That's the first concern. If they're compromised or showing signs of vulnerability, we'll call them up, let them know, here's what's happened, or in this case, call up CSI, who will then say, look, CSI, this is what we've seen. Part of our relationship means they know they can action on it straight away, and then that they can respond to that threat or mitigate against it straight away. After that, we then feed it back to threat intelligence teams who can start to hone in on what it was that was useful in those threat hunting signatures, and eventually start to make some targeted, responsibly targeted automated detections. We also got to assess the impact. Is it emerging threat? It might be something that's brand new. That alone is not a good reason to start this process. We need to know how many servers can it compromise? What's the reach? Great example, it's the one I'm going to use later on, is Log4j. That had about 9 million developers used Java for their applications, and this module introduced a vulnerability there. So reach is important, and severity. How important is it? But also we need to understand, as a security company, are we affected as well? Because we hold a lot of information for a lot of customers, so we need to make sure we're looking at our own security as well as our customer security and partner security there. Finally, then, what we do is we look to communicate this out. So you saw if someone's affected directly, we contact them individually and work with them, or CSI if it's one of their customers, to identify and remove that compromise. But also we'll tell everybody, look, this is on the radar. Here's what we're doing about it. Here's how you're covered. So they understand. We'll talk to partners as well, so they understand how to communicate this to their customers. Because it's all part of sharing that expertise and that knowledge and making sure that they feel understand that what we're doing is got them covered. We might even also put this on socials and PR agencies to make sure that everyone knows what's happening. And also this allows us to help collaborate with other security organizations to share our knowledge and ultimately thwart that attacker. So before I get into the specific emerging threats that we've seen and threat groups, I just want to set the scene with a little bit of breach statistics that I looked at. And I think the cost is quite clear. We've got them on the left-hand side. You can see similar cost, but slightly more for ransomware versus data breach. What is concerning is that often those two come hand in hand. They ransom you first, take the data, you pay it, then they go for a double extortion and say, that data we took, we're also going to sell that on the dark web unless you pay us some extra money. So it's going to be very costly. But also a big part of that impact is a lost business that comes after you incur a severe cyber attack. So they say 1.26 million just out of lost revenue. People lose faith in you nowadays more than ever. Partners won't deal with you. Organizations won't deal with you. Supply chain compromise is such an important thing. So really, even if you think no one's going to be targeting me, they might find avenues into others. So it's really, we are all connected here. And we have to make sure we appreciate that. And the bottom stat is about the difference between highly compliant and uncompliant. And so that should mean if you're highly compliant, you're going to have a good level of security in place. Isn't always the case. If you're secure, you're always compliant. If you're compliant, you're not always secure. But there's a stark difference there between those who are taking security seriously and those who aren't. So the cost saving is key. And you can see ransomware is the topic that we're going to talk about today. Because on the right-hand side, this stat came out yesterday from the Verizon DBIR. If you haven't read that, it's a great report. But you can see it's been steadily increasing. That's because financial motivation is the key motivation for these organizations. And they've got even more and more sophisticated, these attackers. You have ransomware as a service who just focus on the final part of ransomware. And also the people who specialize in entry, getting access to networks, then sell it off to the ransomware actors. Because remember, ransomware is at the end of the chain. That's the final action that an attacker occurs. It's not the start of an attack. There is so much that has to happen. They have to gain access. They have to move laterally. They have to escalate privileges. They have to turn off security controls. They have to work out where your backups are on for before they deploy ransomware. So that gives us weeks or months as defenders to actually identify and find this. And that's why this graph is so important. You can see back in 2017, it was months or more that would take people to detect these attacks. So weren't having great threat detection and response programs in place. These days, it's more leaning towards days or less because people are starting to take security more seriously. But you can still see that it's not 100%, right? There are still some attacks that do go unnoticed, whether they're the more sophisticated APTs, the low and slow types of attacks, or whether they're organizations who have left gaps in their security visibility. So that's really important. And ultimately, if you're days or less, the ransomware attack, you can come back from that quite easily. If it's months or more, you've probably crippled your whole organization. That's going to take some time to recover from. So the first group I want to talk about is REvil. This is a ransomware group that first appeared in the Ukraine-Russia conflict regarding the annexation of Crimea. They were a success story in some ways, in that in October 2021, the US and led by the US, but also the collaboration of all the different organizations in security like UK, Australia and the like, worked to help take down these Tor sites. So Tor is part of the deep web, the nodes that you host those on. So you took that off to stop them being able to function so well. November, US were actually able to arrest some affiliates of the group, and they put out a ransom note. I think it was £10 million or so, saying if anyone has information and leads to the arrest, we'll give them that. And they even started working alongside Russia. So January 2022, they struck an agreement with Russia, who handed over 14 affiliates of the group who operate in their country. So really, this looked like a great success story that we were finally able to actually put these groups behind bars who normally hide behind anonymity and let's say grey laws and regulations for requiring a lot of cooperation globally for people to actually go and arrest these people and not turn a blind eye as Russia was previously. Obviously, the relationship between the US and Russia was broken down. In April 2022, we saw the return of this group. So REvil have returned, and they've began to actually conduct ransomware attacks. Interestingly, they very much wanted everyone to know that they were REvil and who they are. They left a lot of clues as to who they were in the code, and also used the same infrastructure. So it's almost a kind of holding up the middle finger to the efforts that went beforehand in order to try and bring them down. Whereas normally what we expect to see from these kind of groups is actually a rebranding. They go in to be somebody else, but also the notoriety plays a big part. If you get REvil who compromise you, you're probably more likely to pay the ransom because you understand this is a sophisticated group. Moving on to Conti, this is the largest of them all. This is the most infamous ransomware group. So these are the big dogs, and there's a lot of information we learned to them recently because they pledged their allegiance to the Russian government in the Ukraine conflict. But they had Ukrainian people working for them within the group. And so there's some infighting, and they ended up releasing the source code as well as all the chat logs. And there's one of the chat logs is there on the right-hand side. There's gigabytes and gigabytes of this, but we've gone through some of the data, and we can see some really interesting stuff about these organizations, actually understand how they work. So this means things like, they have a HR department, right? They have pretty much function like a full ordinary business, and they do interviews for people. It is a little bit shady. It's normally done with the camera off, and some people feel a bit awkward or anxious about this and decide not to proceed. They do hire a lot of people, and because that relationship, they get paid in crypto. People sometimes realize something is off, and they leave. So they have a really high staff turnover. But the benefit of that is they have fantastic documentation. They have documentation on how to gain entry, all the steps in between, and how to do the ransomware attacks. So that was the most sophisticated documentation we've ever seen, and it allowed us to deconstruct the tactics of this group and understand not only Conti, but also how other ransomware groups operate too. So yeah, the threat is evolving. This is now, where we have analysts sitting in a SOC in Cardiff and Houston. They may well have hackers sitting in rooms together, working together, who can take holidays and go to the HR department and book some time off and ask about their benefits and salary. So you can really see the sophistication of this group. By releasing the chats, they disappeared into obscurity because they were basically hamstringed as what they could do. Everybody knew who Conti were. Everybody knew exactly how to detect on them. They needed to go and reimagine themselves if they ever were to return. And so they disbanded. One thing I didn't mention actually is they do have links to the FSB. They had talked about that in the chat, though we're not certain if that actually makes any real type of link, but it implies that there is something there. So you can see where hacker group and nation state start to bleed over. And even if they're not one and the same, sometimes the nation states will turn blind eyes if the right objectives are pursued, aka attacks on the West. April and May, we start to see them. They've returned actually, and they've ransomed a largest ransomware attack on a government in Costa Rica. They've taken over multiple different departments and they've locked them out of there. And it was the same time that a new prime minister or leader actually started in Costa Rica, and he declared a state of emergency, which I think just shows the severity of this now, that this is almost like war that we're getting towards in some of these cases. So that's still ongoing. We yet to see resolution from that. We actually think that there was nothing too special about that attack, and they are shouting a lot more about it to try and make it known that Conti are back. They think they're not back in full capacity by any means. They are just very much trying to use the publicity of that of having compromised Costa Rican government infrastructure. But we've not seen them elsewhere. And in fact, after that, they disbanded again. They said that Conti is forever over. So you can see that kind of PR stunt, but they do promise to be back in different forms. And so we are on the lookout for indicators that we have that they might not know about them. This could be things as simple as misspelling of scripts, or it can be infrastructure they type to use. Understanding that a lot of this is going to change, but we might see some commonalities, things like a crypto wallet. That might be something someone doesn't want to change because they always want to have the same crypto wallet there. So we've got one eye on this group. Now, I looked at some kind of severe examples there, and I don't mean to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's certainly not the way to approach security, but it is important to understand the magnitude of the capabilities and resources these groups have. But if we look at the current state, this is from the National Cybersecurity Center. They clearly state that there is no specific threats to the UK organizations right now from Russia or Ukraine. But historically, there has been a pattern of international consequences spilling out. So if you go back to 2015, 2017, that was actually probably the rise of ransomware. And after that, we saw it proliferate globally and start to target other organizations. And that's probably where, like I say, Petya came from, Revil, not Revil, who used the Petya malware, and also Conti. The US, I include this one because I think it's quite interesting, but they do, my company is US, so they like to over sensationalize things sometimes. But this says the same thing, right? That there's no clear evidence of anyone being targeted right now, but every organization, large and small, must be prepared to respond to disruptive cyber incidents. And that's the messaging from both of these bodies. And they've released a lot of information as to what you can do in order to take steps to mitigate against attacks and also make sure you've got good detection and response programs in place. So be prepared, but there's nothing specific that's on the horizon threatening UK organizations now. But don't think that just because you're a small organization that you're going to escape from the fallout of this. They are very much opportunists. They often don't know what they're getting into when they start to, but if they find a way in, that's what they care about most. Which leads us on to how they get in. And these are the top vulnerabilities targeted by Russian threat actors. So we talked at the top of the call, we talked about emerging threats, those kind of new 0 days that are out there. You'll notice that this whole table, the latest it goes to is 2020. There's also one that's kind of lesser used that goes to 2021. It was the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability. But all of these are essentially ways to gain access into an environment, so entry points. And yeah, they're going after these known vulnerabilities, this older information. Don't be obsessed with the latest new thing. While it's important to have stuff in place, oftentimes it's easier just to go after this low-hanging fruit, and they'll scan the internet for these type of vulnerabilities. Like if you've got a Citrix server, they'll probe that and see if they can just get in. Because again, they can make money off you, whoever you are, whether that's stealing your data and selling it on the dark web or selling credentials, or whether they're able to actually get you to pay a ransom. So look out for, in Alert Logic, we help you prioritize these kind of patches. And when we find out these are being targeted by Russian threat actors, if we see our customers, look, they've got a 2017 vulnerability that's still present in their environment, we'd go and speak to them personally or speak to CSI and say, look, can you talk to your customers who have this and say, here's the added context that you need to apply, that this might not have been targeted for the last 5 years and they've gotten away with it, but now we're starting to see a real rise in it. So please make sure they patch that one as urgency. So this is all about having that reliable partner who can give you the security expertise you need to make sure that you're effectively spending your time where it matters in security, because you can't patch absolutely everything. The best organizations try, and it's difficult. Got to keep up with change management cycles and the like. So moving on to notable emerging threats. And so those are the older vulnerabilities. And I really want to make that point that older vulnerabilities are still important. I think it's the same conversation that people have had since the 90s and early 2000s is, have we patched our systems? That's still going on today. That part of security has not changed at all. Vulnerabilities let people in, and people don't know when they have vulnerabilities, and they also leave them unpatched, thinking everything's going to be fine. But also then, when you look at the known stuff, that's an easy quantity to address and to account for. What happens about these emerging threats, these 0 days, the stuff that is so new that existing controls don't always work? A Log4Shell is the example I'm going to go on to in a moment, because that is the largest one. You may have been affected by that on this call if you have any Java applications. And we've only just seen people start to kind of calm down on using that Log4Shell exploit, because it was so common across every organization and it gave them full access. So they loved it. Attackers absolutely loved that one. We then had the Spring4Shell, which followed in early 2022. As you can see by the name, it had some similarities, and it sent our researchers into a bit of a frenzy initially, thinking this is going to be the same kind of impact again. In reality, it wasn't as important. It required a lot of knowledge about the server you were attacking, almost as if you'd been part of the development stages. So really, although it could get you to the same outcomes as Log4Shell exploit, it was very difficult to exploit successfully. So we investigated it, and it wasn't so serious. We put that communications out to our partners and our customers to explain why they shouldn't be too concerned, despite the similar name and the sensationalism that goes along with it. PoonKit and Dirty Pipe are both used internally to gain escalation privileges. So once you get on a machine, you want to escalate to that root or admin level privileges if you can, because then you've got the keys to the castle, right? It's a difference between breaking into the gates of a castle to actually taking hold of the main tower. And that's the difference between entry and privilege escalation. So that's really important for this. Often the next steps attackers will use to get in. And when they're so new, you might not be able to detect they've moved on to the next stage. You might think everything's fine without you knowing, oh, look, they've actually progressed down that kill chain. And the Okta breach was a big one as well, because that was a single sign-on provider. If anyone's tried to implement zero trust, you may have done a form of it, which ends up trusting some elements, and often that will probably be your VPN or your single sign-on provider. And they're not invincible to breaches as well. So that also, although I commend you for going to zero trust or a form of zero trust, trusting a provider like that, they are fallible also, and they were breached internally via passwords that were kind of leaked essentially, and they got access to them rather than an exploit. And people sat within that, and so we had to look to our customers and check all their logs and work with them, because they knew the context of what was real and what wasn't, to find if that had happened to them as well, if it spread. And then latest one on our radar was F5 Big IP. There was a previous one in 2020 that was similar to the F5 Big IP. So this is quite common in our customer base. So we've done a lot of work in making sure we have coverage for it. But actually, we've not seen any successful exploitation of this vulnerability. So yeah, although we go all hands on deck sometimes, and sometimes we do see all the exploits that have been successful, like Log4Shell. Sometimes we don't, but that's a great outcome for us as well. We need to take each of these seriously, because at the beginning, when we start investigating, we don't really know the full capability of how this is going to be used or how it's going to turn out. So we have to treat them all with severity. And our customers and our partners can all, and even yourselves, can find all the emerging threats on our support center. So if you type in Alert Logic emerging threats, that will come up, and you can see all the ones we document there. And we also follow us on Twitter. We put out posts as and when we find stuff, and often we're some of the first to the scene with the MDR sphere for that. Cool. So I appreciate coming up towards the end of the threat intelligence threat landscape review. And I really want to end you with an example of what this looks like in practice. And I'm going to start with just explaining what the exploit was. So this phase 1 exploit attempt, this was what was brand new. This was the 0 day. They could send a certain request to the victim website that had this log4j module, which was open source. So loads of people just plugged it in. Why waste time rewriting something when you've got one you can just grab off the shelf? And there was a flaw in the log4j module that allowed the victim server that logs the request to actually reach out to another server. The intention initially was just to get more log information, grab it later. That was how they designed it when they put this feature in there. 7-6 years later, they realized, oh, look, we can use this to point them to our malicious server and actually get it to pull down malicious scripts that then allow us to install ourselves on this server. At that point, they can then move on to command and control. They've got a backdoor. They can start to pivot into different machines, and they can finally carry on their action on objective, which could be ransomware. It could be a crypto miner. We saw a lot of that being installed on the hosts. So, but regardless of what that final objective is, all these steps need to happen beforehand. And that's really what I was getting at when I talked about ransomware. Ransomware being the tip of the iceberg. Ransomware is the outcome of an attack. It is not the attack itself. And all this stuff has to happen beforehand. And it gives us as defenders a lot of time to identify this and then work with someone like CSI to disrupt this kill chain that we see on the top. So they never actually get to actions and objectives. So phase 1, brand new. There was no content for this in the automated sphere because we didn't know it existed. There was a proof of concept released, and you could add that as a detection. Then you'd catch one example of the attack, but attackers are always looking for derivatives. How can I tweak this slightly? So superficially it looks different, but actually performs the same function. And so that's why it's really important that when you have threat researchers, they take a deep look into this. I don't just want something that ticks a box. And yes, I've got one detection that works for Log4j. I want to make sure I can catch all of them. And interestingly, they actually had done this years prior. They'd made a load of signatures in Java because they knew Java is so common and has loads of historic vulnerabilities, like if you go back to Apache struts in 2017 or so to now. So they that foresight, that effort they took to make sure we had content around that meant in our hunting telemetry, our analysts could go back and look at that and they could find examples of this brand new exploit. How they were warned and how they were known to go and look at these signatures, because we have coverage for the installation command and control phase. So these kind of phase 2 scripts we start seeing being pulled down. There's actors that we track as well, threat groups. We give them nice ice cream flavor names because we think that's quite unintimidating, like mint or strawberry. But mint are a great example. They actually are very sophisticated. They jump on these straight away. And we know exactly what their installation and command and control phase look like. So we saw mint have got hold of all these machines. How? We don't know yet. Let's expand our search and work backwards to look at what it could have been. And that's where we found the examples of the exploits. So that gave us early warning to this attack, and it gave our customers an early head start so that they could really, anyone who's affected could respond to it very quickly. And anyone who wasn't affected, we identified their vulnerable servers and notified them with mitigation steps before they were actually targeted. And this at the bottom just kind of sums off this defense in depth that's important of your security strategy. I'm sure you'll have firewall or EDR, AV, maybe DLP in your network, in your environment right now. That's really important to have there. If you can stop an attack at the front, great, do it. But you need to pair this with detection as well beneath that, because detection has got a wider sphere. We're happy to catch false positives because our analysts are looking at them and downgrading them. And it's not bothering the end user or our partner or our customers who then get given only verified, validated instance. It means we can cast a wider net than, say, a prevention technology where it casts its net too wide and catches things that are benign, false positives. They're going to take a blocking action. That's going to stop you doing your work. And that's, ultimately security is here to make sure that your operations on a daily basis are allowed to continue without any impact. So if a tool starts impacting you, it's kind of defeating the whole object there. So prevention and detection, essential for any security posture. Great. So now we'll look at some of the considerations for selecting the right partner. Hopefully you understand really the value of threat intelligence and how that can help you catch the latest vulnerabilities, as well as help you understand when older vulnerabilities might be more important to you now. It's that context that you can apply with that. But when you're looking for the right partner, regardless of who it is, you need to understand the breadth of detection. What is it that you have in your environment? Do you have AWS, Azure presence? Do you have private cloud presence? Do you have Oracle servers? What kind of databases do you have? What web applications are you running? What switches, what firewalls? All of that needs to be considered, including your SaaS applications, your Salesforce, your Okta, your Azure AD. Make sure a partner can operate wherever you are, so they have that breadth of detection. And the second question should be, now, how deep does that go? Does it still my use cases of, say, credential compromise? Do you have user behavior norm detection in place to catch that when someone behaves abnormally with my credentials? Of course we do, but it's an important question to ask. Get the breadth in and then go down to the depth. Next is layers of defense. So you saw there how I had prevention and detection stacked together. You need to make sure that you are having that belt and braces approach to security, and prevention must be paired with detection in order to operate effectively. And actually they can inform each other. Stuff that we detect and pass off to CSI, they can advise their customers to actually go and add different rules or configure their firewalls for blocking certain IPs, or maybe their EDRs, to make sure that they're focused on these type of attacks once we know that they're vulnerable to them or that they're being targeted by them. And addressing the entire kill chain. It may seem tempting to stack everything at that exploit stage, make sure nobody can ever get in, but you need to have detections across. And I think the Log4j showed that even though we didn't have the exploit as a detection initially, we had the installation and command and control phases so that we could work upwards or downwards, backwards or forth for when we get a trigger, and then use the human expertise to actually find the additional pieces. Because a trigger can come from anywhere, and then we can fill in the gaps quite easily there. And final is people, process, and tools. There are a lot of tools out there that will be able to tick all the boxes of the things that I've covered so far, but you're not going to get full value out of them if you haven't got people and process that are able to have the expertise to use it and know what to do in the given scenario. So the metaphor I use is like an F1 car. If you buy an F1 car, you need a driver who's capable of taking it around the tracks at the breakneck speeds. And you need a team of engineers who monitor all the different statistics within the tires and all that to make sure it's running smoothly, and then do those kind of pit stop maintenance things. Ultimately, that gives you the best, allows you to get the best time out of that F1 car. Otherwise, you've bought a really nice, shiny F1 car that just sits on the drive. And to understand people, process, and tools, I want to zero in on that, because I think that's where this audience maybe is hard to identify. If you are maybe knowledge gapped, your IT team has some understanding of security, but you don't maybe have the tooling to go and action on that, or maybe you don't have enough people to actually dedicate to that. Maybe your IT guys are fantastic at security, but their main focus needs to be on the operations of your organization and development of new applications and the like. So if that's you, I really want to have a discussion about you at the end. So please work out which one of these you might fall into, and we'll discuss it as we get to the end of the presentation. The second one is resource gaps. You know what you need to do, but you don't have staff or time to deliver the security that you know you need. That can also be an impact. Or finally, if you might be outcome gapped. So we have investment in security, we have tools in place, but it's just not working anymore. Maybe your environment's moved on, maybe the threats have moved on, and you understand that I'm not getting the value, there's got to be a better way. And so that really looks like this. When we're looking at the people, process, and tools piece, the first one, you have the people in place, but not the process and tools, which means your outcome is lacking. And you really need to focus on outcomes when you're looking at security. Don't focus on, do you have X, Y, and Z detections? Focus on, can you stop my billing server from being compromised? It's running this, and then get them to answer that so they give you the outcome. Next is then that people gap. So you're low on people, your process and tools are in place. Again, you can't get that outcome that is required. And finally, you have people and tools, but your process isn't right. Maybe you have gaps in visibility because you don't know how to set the deployment correctly, and you're not maintaining that healthy deployment. Or maybe the people are great, but they don't know how to use all these different tools. They're logging into 5 or 6 different tools just to perform one outcome. And that was a slightly better outcome, I think that's fair to say, but it's still not getting the maximum outcome there. So we're looking into the solution now. I think the solution really is managed detection and response if you answered yes to any of those problems, and it's focusing on outcomes, and the outcomes should be reducing the likelihood of successful attacks and reducing the impact of a successful attack. And that's what Alert Logic and CSI are here to help deliver for our customers. When we bring in the kill chain to that, you can see how this kind of fits. On the left-hand side, before you get to the exploit, the pre-breach, you want to know what you've got, asset discovery. You want to know what holes there might be there in it or risks. So by doing vulnerability checks and also configuration checks. That's a real big issue for any kind of breach. It's still one of the highest entry vectors, is people just making a mistake, configuring something. It's not very glamorous. Unfortunately, it's what happens more often than not in the glamorous type of attacks. So having a partner to point you the right direction and tell you where security best practices are is really important. And then the right-hand side, when we get to that exploit installation and so on stage of the kill chain, it's about being ready to respond to that threat. So you can have that mean time to detection is really low. We have a 50-minute SLA to detect these things. And then that means you can respond to these really quickly. So rapid detection, rapid notification, recommendations on how to respond. And included, we also have some automation. So automated response, so you can actually take some actions automatically. Disabling a user when we see that user is compromised in the middle of the night is a great example of that. And this is the approach of how we do it. So I talked a lot about the outcomes. Understand you want to also see a little bit of this under the covers of how this works. So coverage, we have coverage across the entire environment. We try to be as agnostic as possible. It's really important that we make use of security investments you may have already made. We don't say, oh, we only work with you if you have this type of EDR vendor. Nope, if you've got Carbon Black, SentinelOne, Sophos, CrowdStrike, all those and more, we'll make use of that security investment and use that to inform our detections, as well as doing some more to the source, network IDS visibility, full packet inspection, and log ingestion as well. All that data is collected by our platform, ingested. We are built on AWS ourselves, so we have a completely scalable architecture. That means that whatever happens, if everyone's getting bombarded in our customer base, we can still detect all those, and analysts can deal with all that. We have analytical engines, correlations, behavioral, machine learning, that AI, user behavior norm detection, that's really important. And that's something we've built over 20 years of doing this detection. So we've human-led these exercises. We've taught our AI how to respond to this. And ultimately that culminates in the expertise that we have to actually triage and analyze these incidents and escalate them to our customers and educate them. Here's what you need to do to respond to this, and here's what you need to do going forward so it doesn't happen again. And when I was a security analyst, I actually used to work with partners like CSI. I would call up the CSI SOC, and it's great to have that working relationship with them because they are able to get to that resolution really, really quickly. So Leighton, it'd be great for you to talk a little bit about how this feeds into CSI at this stage.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So obviously we've covered areas of the MDR approach around, the tooling, the platform, and the security expertise behind that. But one of the things that we find day to day within CSI around the sort of the white glove approach that we take is the ongoing support, the recommendations, and supporting some of the remediational activity, particularly around sort of critical or high security incidents that ourselves and Alert Logic obviously can see within the SOC. So typically, as part of the ongoing management with this, we typically support the ongoing deployment. We put sort of project management around that. So we make sure that the actual onboarding for the technology is done correctly. We also support some of the vulnerability patching and guidance around ongoing patches. I think one of the things that Josh mentioned earlier, with some of the threat landscape that was out there is obviously a lot of emerging new threats and zero-day threats that are out there. But sometimes it's about just doing the basics and doing the basics right. We work with a number of different frameworks and, frameworks ranging from things like ISO 27001 to PCI DSS for some of our regulated workload clients. But some of the best principles and some of the basic foundations that I think is really important are things that are aligned to something like Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus. You can take a lot of guidance from those types of recommendations and frameworks and apply those and, apply those to your environment for your defense in depth, but also as well to help with obviously security incidents that are seen within the environment. And that's probably where the likes of our service and our partnership with Alert Logic come in, where we can help you with that guidance, help you with that ongoing remediation, and similarly be able to drive some of the automation that's within the platform. So some of the stuff that we do here around defined use cases, we're able to bring a quick route to value. And what do I mean by that? So the technology and the platform within Alert Logic is very vast and very, very, very in depth in regards to its capabilities. So what we have learned over time working with different clients is that we've identified what works within one client can be replicated similarly over to another client. So sort of what we have done is built out playbooks and alarms and use cases that sort of we can get you up and running very quickly and start triaging security incidents and applying sort of security prevention, particularly around certain environments, whether that's private cloud, hybrid, or public cloud use cases. Obviously, we've touched on the access to the skilled SOC analysts. It's all good and well having the latest and greatest technology, but you still definitely need the right processes and people around that to support that. And with obviously the access to over 150 SOC analysts as part of this service, we're able to provide quite an in-depth 24/7 security SOC service. And obviously the idea is that we're trying to drive all of this back into a single pane of glass. So there will be tool sets that you no doubt already have in place. It's not necessarily about suggesting that those are then ripped and replaced with something like this. The idea is that we want to ingest those tools, those security tools that you already have, and enrich those and take those feeds and those threat intels and build upon the capabilities of what Alert Logic has, but also as well be able to respond to potentially new incidents that come in from those tools and bring visibility as well as remediation. And then I think the final slide then we have is around obviously why CSI and Alert Logic. So we obviously look to try and make sense of the noise and deliver what is important for you. We're appreciative of the fact that you obviously have day-to-day jobs. You may not have the teams or the size to have dedicated NOCs and SOCs that just spend time reviewing logs and analysing threats. So the idea is that we want to be able to bring the intel from the tools, from your environment, and identify sort of the main focus targeted, high critical security incidents that we need to focus on, and then deliver the recommendation, the remediational steps that we think you need to apply to close those gaps. You obviously have access to the highly skilled security specialists and the around-the-clock coverage with regards to the 150 plus SOC security analysts. And what I mentioned about earlier about sort of helping you avoid compliance and governing issues, you know, some of the use cases that we have are aligned to frameworks within the industry that I've named a few being, you know, around all things ISO 27001, PCI DSS, NIST, Cyber Essentials. Is there anything else that you wanted to add around that, Josh?
I think it's just worthwhile talking with Alert Logic and CSI. It's very much that end-to-end service, right? Sometimes we would raise stuff to CSI. Here's a critical compromise. CSI would then act on it, remediate it, and then customer wakes up in the morning and they look, oh, there was a critical compromise, but it's been resolved on our behalf by Alert Logic and CSI, which I think is a real great story, particularly for those who are gapped on that side.
Perfect.
So I think, sorry.
No, go on.
Yeah, just go to the kind of the closing slide now, and I think later we wanted to kind of see if anybody has got any answers for those 3 questions. If you put it in the Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand, we'll try and get you off mute if you want to talk on this as well. But did you resonate with any of those, that you have an IT team but you don't know what to do, or you know what to do but you don't have the budget? That'd be great to kind of hear from the audience if possible.
Yeah, let's open it up. Ideally, if there's anybody within the attendees that have any questions from today's call, please feel free to ask, or if you would like to put it in the chat, by all means. While we're just sort of waiting perhaps for anybody that might have any questions, I do have a prepared question, ironically enough, Josh. But you mentioned earlier about within the slides, you spoke about breadth of detection. Can you sort of maybe give me your response to how important is the depth as well in regards to that?
Yeah, I think I touched on it briefly, but yeah, the understanding, you can write a detection that is literally a tick box. I think a good example is like bits jobs, or maybe PowerShell living off the land attacks, right? You can have content for that says, I cover off this MITRE attack framework technique, for example. But the depth, it means, does it go where I need it to go? Is it an accurate detection? That means it's not going to have loads of false positives. Is it going to find what I'm really trying to find? And the best way you understand the depth of something is think about what the risk is to your organization. So if it is ransomware, if it's a database, you worry about data exfiltration, that type of server, ask about the depth of detections they have around that to actually find that out, because you'll be surprised that it might not just be, right, here are all our database detections. It's actually might be beyond that. Here are credential detections. Here are web app detections that can be entries through there. So there's a lot of ways to think about it, but it's really important that once you identify breadth, you query the depth, because depending on who you are, I think MSSPs are probably the most guilty of this, who are kind of quite fresh into the SOC game. They will tick a lot of boxes for you, but the outcomes are not always there, because it does take a long time. And as you see with our threat research teams, a lot of curation to create this responsible detections.
Brilliant, makes sense. I guess off the back of that, I do have one other following question, actually. And you mentioned in one of the slides that you obviously manage probably today around sort of just shy of 4,000 plus clients worldwide. So I guess for those that are on the call today, their question might be, how do you manage so many clients effectively and securely? And, how can you help them as an organization with obviously managing so many clients and do that in an effective, secure way?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because I talk about the benefit of seeing into 4,000 customers and that community immunity that it gives us, because we can see something in one customer, learn the lesson from that, and then go and apply it across all the other customers at no additional kind of effort or cost. But the question I get asked a lot is, how do I know that I'm getting enough of the value out of your 150 analysts if there's 4,000 they have to address? And really that it's about the scalability that we've created with this platform. I talk about machine learning and AI detections. We do, if it's something can be automated fully, we'll automate it. If it's going to be potentially higher critical, that'll always be seen by a person. But they're really directed to what they need to see, with either the machine tells them this is most likely the successful bit. We have processes in place that pull in data to enrich it straight away, so they get really quick time to resolution, which all means that we can work under that 50-minute SLA, and obviously ongoing training with our research team and the analysts is constant. But I think what's really important to note is that we don't allocate a certain number of support time to any customer or any partner. You get as much support and as much triage, as much incident investigations as is required. If you're experiencing a breach, that customer probably needs us for a good few couple of weeks as we get them right the way back if it's a large scale breach, and we will dedicate all the resources we need to make sure that happens. The rest of our customers, 4,000 customers are not going to be breached at the same time. A lot of the stuff we do is making sure that they have good security posture and good security hygiene so that they never get compromised in the first place. Which you can see then, the incentive for us to make sure that you're great in the first place means that we have more time to dedicate on the other stuff on the other side. So it's about balancing all that together. But don't be concerned that you will not get the support you need from Alert Logic, because for us, it's all about giving you as much as you require when you require it.
Perfect. Well, I'm just conscious of time.
Leighton, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A box. One around, can you tell us how the service is set up and also how it's delivered? And then there's a second, much longer question, which I'll let you read and digest.
Okay, lovely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that we wanted to do off the back of today is probably as a next step, actually take you through potentially, for those that are on the webinar today, to potentially do a demo with you where we can actually take you through obviously the UI, the interface, but also actually go into depth actually how the service is delivered. Obviously the service is delivered in partnership with Alert Logic, so we can go through and actually take you through how the solution is onboarded, the deployment, the ongoing watering and feeding and the tuning of the configuration and the roles and responsibilities of that, and obviously outline what some of the service deliverables are around the actual service across the 24/7 operation. So we have left a QR code actually on the screen at the moment in regards to, if you're interested to request a demo anonymously, then you can by all means follow the link, and that will take you through to request a demo off the back of today's call. But also we've left both myself and Joshua's details on the presentation. So if there is anybody that wants to reach out and request for that, you are more than welcome to drop us an email and we can follow up with a demo, and we can then obviously take you through in more detail how the service is onboarding and what the services and the deliverables around that.
Mm-hmm. Great. And later, we've got a really good question about the kind of ransomware topic that we discussed. So understanding the point that I made, that ransomware is that final action objective where they're trying to get to. This question is, what do we see as the favorite ways at the starting point? Is it always phishing emails, or do they use other and then do they use vulnerabilities to escalate, or is there other common starting points? And I've actually covered this in a webinar at length. If you want to look up that Alert Logic ransomware, you might find something there. We also have an article called Demystifying Ransomware Detection, where we touch on some of the key elements. Phishing is a common attack vector. It's not the most common. I think actually credential compromise is the most common, followed by web exploits, followed by phishing, and then followed by web exploits for entry, to gain entry into an organization. But what's really interesting is, phishing is quite difficult to detect, right? But the next actions of phishing aren't that difficult to detect, right? Whether that's to open up a piece of malware that runs on the machine, we can detect that then, or whether it's to compromise credentials, and we can see that they've now behaving abnormally, being used in abnormal ways, so we can detect that. But the other key ways we see, particularly over the pandemic, there's a lot of RDP or VPN exploitation. Lots of people get that sense of security. If I've got a VPN, everything that's within that VPN can now be, relaxed the security controls. That's simply not true, because they can brute force their way into a VPN, or use credential stuffing attacks, which is more common these days, which is more of a low and slow version. So that's a really common entry point. But also, exploits is a key one too. So web exploits that gain you entry into an organization and then allow you to move along those. People are really important. Education is really important. Phishing is still a key element of that. But you also need to make sure you have the detection processes in place, because even with the best educated staff, there's still people going to make mistakes, and you have to catch those next actions of phishing before they can progress further down the kill chain. So it's not just exploits we look for, it's also anomalous activity, and whether that is people creating accounts that they shouldn't have to maybe get their persistence mechanisms up going, or whether that's just performing actions we've never seen them do before. All of these can be good reasons for us to go and investigate.
Perfect. Thank you, Josh. If there aren't any other questions in the panel, then what I would like to say is obviously thank you everybody for your time today, for joining. Do feel free to request a demo either via our contact details or via the QR code. And if you'd like to know more, then please feel free to reach out. But thank you again for your time, and hope you found it useful.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Leighton, and thanks
You're
everyone
welcome.
for attending.
Thank you.